that leads me to our second ask, and I think what I'll do is kind of try to go through these ask by ask, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments, because some of your questions might get answered as I go along. The next thing is a draft letter to the Secretary of State asking for an investigation into violations of the Arms Export Control Act. So if your member of Congress says, well, I'll consider these amendments, I'm not sure, I'm not on the Appropriations Committee, you know, you can press them, but at the end of the day, if they say no and they're not going to do it, they're not going to do it. So this is kind of a backup request. It's a little bit more easy on them than to stand up on the floor of Congress and say we should restrict military aid to Israel. This is in the form of a letter. Now, it could be done either as a Dear Colleague letter, where they agree to initiate it and send it around to all their colleagues on the Hill to get other signatures before it's sent to the State Department, or they can send a letter to the Secretary of State directly without having to make it a whole big public issue. So basically, this just asks Secretary of State Clinton to have her State Department do exactly what's specified in the law. And that is, when there's a violation of this law, when U.S. military aid has been misused by a country to commit human rights violations, that it submit a report to Congress documenting those violations. And then it's up to Congress to actually implement the sanctions that are called for in that law. So unfortunately, we're kind of still at the first step in trying to get accountability on the misuse of U.S. weapons by Israel. But it only takes one member of Congress to actually trigger an investigation. So if you can get your member of Congress even to send this as a private letter to Secretary of State Clinton, or something like it, you know, they'll take this and they'll use their own language and that's fine. That will get the process rolling and would be very helpful in our efforts to challenge military aid to Israel. Third, Zahir talked about the Dear Colleague letter that called for the easing of humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip. We thought that that was a good Dear Colleague letter and we supported it, but we think we need to go one step further. We need to have a resolution that explicitly calls for an end to the blockade of the Gaza Strip. And what we have here is some draft legislation which you can give to your members of Congress and ask them to introduce this resolution. And again, they're probably, if they're going to be amenable to it, they'll probably say, well, we'll write our own. But trust me, this will help them, because this lays out the case for why Israel's blockade of Gaza is illegal, according to the 4th Geneva Convention. And if you flip on to the second page, you can also see that it's also against the very U.S. policies that were advocated for by the Bush administration. Remember back to 2005, this was prior to Israel's dismantling of the settlements in Gaza Strip. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice went and brokered an agreement for the free movement of peoples and goods between the Gaza Strip and West Bank. And that was an agreement signed between the PA and Israel under U.S. brokerage. So we want to remind Congress and the Obama administration that the U.S. has already put political capital into making this happen. And also refer them to the UN Security Council resolution that was passed without being vetoed by the Bush administration during Operation Cast Lead, which said, in a little bit different words, that Gaza should not be blockaded as part of the ceasefire. And then, of course, we quote President Obama, and then some examples of how humanitarian aid is being restricted, and then at the end you'll see, now therefore be it resolved that the House of Representatives urges Israel to end the blockade of Gaza. So if you get a member of Congress to say, yes, I agree to introduce this, let us know right away, please. Now there's one more ask which kind of got into the packet at the last minute, which is why I don't have talking points for it, but I think you all already know the talking points. This is something that we're doing. As you all know, the U.S. campaign functions as a coalition of more than 300 organizations, many of which have co-sponsored this event here today. This particular ask is an initiative of a couple different organizations that are part of our coalition. ADC, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and also Jewish Voice for Peace, whose ED you heard here earlier this morning. And it's a very concrete ask, and I think a very, very doable ask. Again, because it's on an issue that most members of Congress are already with us on. And that is to get some accountability around U.S. nonprofits funding Israeli settlement expansion. And this is something that ADC and JVP have taken the lead on, and it's a great ask to make. So what we have here, and Noura mentioned before sanctions being imposed through the Treasury, we've got a draft Dear Colleague letter addressed to the Inspector General of the Department of Treasury, asking for an investigation into the activities of 501c3 nonprofit organizations registered in the U.S., which are providing things like night vision goggles and in some cases actually weapons to Israeli settlements under the guise of educational and religious activities and so forth, which is a flagrant violation of the law where you register for nonprofit status. So what we're doing is asking for an investigation and for a crackdown on these groups that are doing illegal things with their nonprofit status. So those are the four concrete things that we're asking you to bring up with your members of Congress tomorrow in your meetings. In a few minutes, we're going to break into our state delegations to do some role playing and trying to anticipate some of the difficult questions that you might get in these meetings. But let me just give you one pointer to leave you with before I open it up for questions or comments on these policy asks. Make sure that you run these meetings and don't let the meetings run you. In other words, and I'm sure Noura and Zahir can attest to this, congressional staffers are excellent at diverting you from what you want to talk about if they don't want to talk about it. So you have to make sure that you're running the meeting, you're not falling into their trap, especially if it's a hostile office, by getting into tangential debates about whether Yasser Arafat was a terrorist or not. Trust me, that's a favorite tactic. They love to do it. I've seen it in dozens of meetings. You're there to bring up these specific policy asks and to ask them for an answer on them as to whether their offices would be willing to do this or not. Now, that doesn't mean that they have to tell you right away whether they're going to do it. And in fact, they're going to probably tell you, let me think about this, I'll get back to you. And that's okay. That's okay. They're not necessarily brushing you off. They're probably going to want to talk to other colleagues. They're probably going to want to talk to other organizations within their congressional district before they agree to do any one of these things. So that's okay if they say that, but just ask them for a time frame. Can we follow up with you in a week so that we can know whether you're amenable to doing this or not? And then make sure that you do follow up with them and hold them to account. So make sure that you actually make these requests up front. And the way that congressional staffers will usually structure these meetings is they'll, after you do the introductions and everything, they'll say something like, what can we do for you today? Or something like that. That's your cue to launch into these asks. Well, we're here to talk to you about these four policy issues and to ask you for these specific things. And then, you know, figure out who's going to present what, who's going to present which talking points. Maybe you'll want to emphasize one or two of these more than some of the others. Maybe you won't have time to get in all four. Maybe you think one of these will work particularly well with your member of Congress. I'm leaving it up to you all to figure that out because you all know your members of Congress better than I do.